Welcome back to Wrong Sports, and if you are new to the channel, welcome to Wrong Sports. On this channel, I like to cover a variety of different topics in college sports, mostly in college football, and this time I'm going to be going back to another top 10 list before I do a couple of new series of college football firsts that will be coming up in May and June. But on this list, I'm going to be doing the top 10 turnarounds, one-year turnarounds in college football history. But before I get to the list, make sure as always you subscribe to the channel below and of course like and share this video with other college football fans. Ring the bell so you can get updates on brand new videos because I will be dropping new videos coming up all throughout the spring and the summer. And check out my social media. Help out the channel on my Patreon and check out my podcast. All the details are in the description below. But before I get to my list, just a heads up, a lot of these teams are going to be from 1940 and after. If you can think of any ones that I didn't mention or maybe ones from before 1940, comment below. There are a ton you can choose from. This is just my top 10. And it's going to start off with the 1943 Purdue team, which went from 1-8 in 1942 to 9-0. And the reason they are number 10 is because they made this vast improvement using players that weren't really from Purdue. What I mean by that is once World War II started, many colleges around the country either closed or became training schools for the Navy or Army and gained new students through the V-12 program. I have gone over the V-12 program before, but the program allowed college-age men and some older-than-college-age men to train, be housed, and play athletics at one of many American colleges. There were upwards of 120 that were involved in the V-12 or another program like this. So this meant that you could be a pro football player, but since you were drafted and you were training in the V-12 program, you would be able to play college football again. This mostly happened on service teams, not so much in colleges, but Purdue would reap the benefits as they would be a V-12 program, and they gained a great football player, and probably one of the best players in the country, in Alex Agasse. He was an All-American on Illinois, another Big Ten team the previous year. But he would be drafted shortly after the 1942 season and ended up back in the Big Ten at another school. Along with him, Purdue would also gain Tony Bakovich, who would lead the nation in rushing and have 16 touchdowns for Purdue in the 1943 season, and this was with him missing the last two games of the 1943 season. And once again, Bakovich came from Illinois on the V-12 program. The influx of talent was clear for Purdue, as they averaged 3 points per game on offense in 1942 and never scored more than 7 points per game. Along with that, their defense was giving up 20 points per game. But now in 1943, with this influx of players, they were averaging over 20 points per game on offense and were only giving up 6 points per game. Purdue could have had a claim for the national championship that season, but they don't claim it, and they really shouldn't, not only because of the new players they received overnight, but also because they didn't play Michigan and Northwestern, both teams that would be ranked in the top 10 and be at the top of the Big Ten. But I have to put this team on my list because an 8-game improvement is one of the biggest improvements of any college football team in history, and actually, they would be tied for second in the biggest improvement. Finally, Agasse and Bakovich were just a few examples of players during the 1943 through 1945 college football seasons that got drafted, then left their school only to end up at another college. And again, you can hear more about that and the V-12 program during my World War II series about service college football teams, and I'll put a link below in the description box as well as in the upper right-hand corner. Coming in at number 9 is going to be the 1948 Clemson team, which made a 7-win improvement. And this was one of Frank Howard's best teams. And they were coming off the post-war years with 2 5-6 records and finishing at or at the bottom of the 15-team Southern Conference. They would be coming in with an experienced team, especially on their line. And their best player was back in tailback Bobby Gage. Gage had thrown for 1,000 yards and ran for 500 yards in the previous season. And the team also finished pretty well in 1947 as they won their final 3 games. but they were shootouts, so the defense had to improve for them to improve their record. And the defense would do just that, as in 1948 they pitched 2 shutouts to start the season and had a total of 5 in the 1948 season. The offense, meanwhile, was scoring at a high clip, as they had an average of 25 points per game, and they beat Boston College, South Carolina, Auburn, and number 19 ranked Wake Forest. But even though they were 10-0, they were never ranked higher than number 9. They would be invited to the Gator Bowl to play 8-2 Missouri, and they only won by 1 point to finish their perfect season. They wouldn't be considered for the national title, but they did win more games this year than they did the 2 previous years combined. Number 8 is going to be a team that is very famous for a certain reason. They would be known as the Junction Boys. This is the 1955 Texas A&M team, which went from 1-9 in 1954 to 7-2-1 in 1955. And this team was called the Junction Boys due to surviving a brutal as well as probably an illegal summer training camp run by Bear Bryant, who put his team through this brutal training camp just before the 1954 season, and it sounds like a summer camp I don't want to be a part of. But ESPN did a great movie about the Junction Boys about 20 years ago. If you can find it online, definitely check it out. But Bear Bryant wanted to turn around this program by doing the same thing he did at Kentucky, which was to make his teams tough, and he thought this Junction summer camp would do the trick. And he also wanted to bring Texas A&M back to prominence, since they had won 3 previous national championships before the 1940s, but had fallen on hard times in the last 10 years, as they only had 2 winning records. To do this, Bear Bryant would set up a 10-day camp in Junction, Texas for his team that numbered anywhere between 80 and 100. Junction at this time was going through a drought, and they were averaging 100-degree heat, but Bear Bryant would still put his squad through brutal drills with little to no water. Some famous stories say that the team was only given a wet wash rag during practice, and they would lose 10 to 20 pounds just in sweat. Just an insane camp, which resulted in many players leaving the camp before the 10 days were done. When the camp was over, 38 players survived, 2 of which would become famous names and famous coaches in Gene Stallings and Jack Pardee. But even though the team was tough, it didn't result in an immediate turnaround, as they went 1-9 in Bear's first season, giving him his worst season ever, and his first losing season as well. The next year, the team would get better, as they would also add a future Heisman winner in John David Crow, as well as the Junction Boys coming back from 1 year of playing time. But they wouldn't start the 1955 season that good. That was because they lost 21-0 to UCLA, who would then win the PCC and go to the Rose Bowl. But after that, Texas A&M would be on fire, as they won their next 3 games. These were all out-of-conference games, and they only gave up 3 points. Then they won 4 of their next 5 games, all versus Southwestern Conference opponents, and they tied Arkansas. That would be something to remember, because they were in the driver's seat for the Southwest Conference Championship in their finale versus Texas. Texas A&M had lost to Texas in their last 3 games, and it would happen again, as the Longhorns would spoil their season, and Texas A&M would lose the Southwestern Conference title to TCU, who A&M beat earlier in the season, but due to Texas A&M tying Arkansas, TCU would win the conference because they had 5 wins to Texas A&M's 4. But Texas A&M went on an astounding 6-game improvement, and this would lead into an unbeaten 1956 season, John David Crow winning the Heisman in 1957, and it just put another notch in the legendary coaching belt of Bear Bryant. Number 7 is going to be Notre Dame from 1964, as they went from 2-7 in 1963 to 9-1. And this was the team that started the Ara Parseghian era. Notre Dame was coming off several very bad years. Yes, very bad years. I know they were 5-5, but they were just mediocre. Joe Kaharick was the coach, and they had no winning record since 1958. The 1963 season was coached by the resident Notre Dame bridge coach, Hugh DeVore, who also coached the 1945 season as they bridged to another legendary coach in Frank Leahy. And the 1963 season under Hugh DeVore didn't go that well, as they started 2-2 and then lost their remaining games to be 2-7. They would then hire Ara Parseghian from Northwestern, who had built Northwestern into a very good program that was routinely beating Notre Dame. And Ara Parseghian would also inherit a pretty senior-laden team, as he had John Hewart as his top quarterback and Jack Snow as one of his best ends. Plus, he had All-American Jim Carroll captaining his defense and his team. And with this senior-laden team, Ara Parseghian was able to nearly double his offensive output this year, and his defense gave up less than 7 points per game. The new Notre Dame would go on a tear through the 1964 season, and after their second shutout of the year, and at 6-0, they were ranked number 1 for the first time since the 1950s. Their team would be 9-0 as they went to LA for their yearly game versus 7-2 USC. And this game was looking like it was going to be a completely dominant Notre Dame win that would also give them the national title, as they were up 17-0 in the third quarter. But from then on, USC would score 3 touchdowns and take the undefeated season and national title away from Notre Dame as USC won 20-17. Notre Dame would make a 7-win improvement from the previous year, and they were only minutes away from the national championship. But what makes this turnaround even bigger and better is that this was the exact same team that went 2-7 the previous year. So it shows just how big and important a coaching hire can be. Just outside the top 5 at number 6 is going to be the 1951 Georgia Tech team, which went from 5-6 to unbeaten. And what a way to win your first national title. That was what came from this year and turnaround for Georgia Tech under Bobby Dodd. Dodd was in his 7th season at Georgia Tech and saw a lot of successes, like a 10-1 season and an Orange Bowl win in his second year. But then after consecutive 7-win seasons and then a 5-6 season, it was looking like his coaching career was taking a downturn. But with Dodd's interesting and different coaching style, as he didn't believe in physical practices but smart and precise practices, he could keep his players safe and also develop his team not only physically but mentally. The new strategy would see big results this season too, as this team only gave up double-digit points one time, as during the regular season they had a 14-14 tie versus Duke, which was their only negative during this season. Georgia Tech would also beat Kentucky, who were coached by Bear Bryant, in mid-September. This set them up for the rest of their season, as they handily beat Alabama and Georgia too, to be 7-0 in the SEC and be the champions. But this was only due to Tennessee playing 5 SEC games and also going undefeated, and I've always been annoyed during this time of the SEC in the 1950s and 60s when everyone didn't play everyone, and everyone played a different amount of conference games for some weird reason. But anyway, Georgia Tech ended their season with a 3-point win over a top 10 Baylor team to be 11-0-1 and win a share of the national title. But this turnaround was also the start of Georgia Tech's 31-game unbeaten streak that would lead to another national title in 1952. Kicking off the top 5 with the 1980 Florida Gators team, which went from a winless team to an 8-win team. And what a turnaround this was for a team, as the Gators finished in the bottom half of the SEC for the last decade or so. But when Charlie Pell came to Gainesville, he completely changed their offense and defense, as well as got more boosters to help improve the program. Unfortunately, all the new things didn't help the Gators at first, as in 1979, they went 0-10-1, but they were also plagued by a lot of injuries, as well as players not being able to learn the new system that Pell had. But coming into the 1980 season, the coach would change up some things, as well as bring in some new assistants to run the offense in Mike Shanahan. Mike Shanahan at this point was under 30 years old, but he showed he could run a pretty good offense, as he did that for Minnesota in 1979. And Shanahan would also have the benefit of having a really good wide receiver in Chris Collinsworth, who was Florida's best player on offense the previous 2 years. With the new offensive coordinator, the team would win their first 3 games, scoring over 30 points per game and getting ranked, as they were ranked number 19. They would lose their next game, but then win 4 out of their last 7 to be 7-4. And they weren't getting blown out like they did in previous years, as they only lost to number 3 Florida State by 4 points, and they were less than a minute away from upsetting number 2 Georgia until an incredible 94-yard touchdown reception with a minute left ended those hopes. But Florida would end the season 7-4 and would be invited to the Tangerine Bowl, which was the first time they went to a bowl game in 3 years. Florida would win on the hands and on the back of Chris Collinsworth as he was the MVP, and ended an amazing turnaround for Florida as they went 8-4, giving them an 8-win improvement and making them the first team to go to a bowl game after finishing the previous season winless. And speaking of going winless and then turning it all around, coming in at number 4 is the 2000 South Carolina Gamecocks team. And this is one of the turnarounds that a lot of college football fans will point to, and they are right, because this team was completely buried in 1999 and then completely looked different to start the millennium. And the coaching staff would be the same coming into the 2000 season as it was in 1999, as it would start the Lou Holtz era. And Lou Holtz would come to Columbia after a 3-year retirement and brought with him his son Skip to be the offensive coordinator and Charlie Strong to run the defense. And Skip was actually the coach of UConn from 1994 to 1998, but stepped down to be with his dad, and Charlie Strong came to Columbia after working at Notre Dame from 1995 to 1998. And Lou Holtz would do what he would do best, and that would be recruiting, motivating, and building a culture, which brought in some great freshmen, even after a winless 1999 season. The coaching staff, and especially Charlie Strong's defense, would show just how different this team was, as in Game 1, they shut out New Mexico State 31-0 to win their first game in 2 years. They followed it up with a huge 21-10 win over number 10 Georgia. And they did that at home, and then they would beat Mississippi State 2 weeks after that to be 4-0, and they would be ranked all before September was up. Unfortunately, though, after they got ranked, they would lose their first road game versus Alabama, but then would follow it up with 3 SEC wins to have 5 that year, which was more than they had in the last 3 years combined. They would now be 7-1, and they had a chance for the SEC title game, but they would unfortunately lose a heartbreaker to Tennessee by 3 points, and then they got beat up by number 4 Florida by 20, and this would knock South Carolina out of contention. South Carolina would be invited to the Outback Bowl to soundly beat Ohio State to be 8-4 for an insane 8-game turnaround, and South Carolina under Lou Holtz would be a good and tough team to beat for the next decade, and it started with this team. Coming in at number 3 is the 1962 USC Trojans, who went from 4-5-1 to being a national championship team. And this is the team that not only gave John McKay his first national title team, but it also saved his job. And I say that because McKay was in his 3rd season and had not had a winning record, even though the team came in 2nd in the AAWU, which was the precursor to the Pac-10. They went 2-1-1 in the 5-team conference in 1961, but they were upset by UCLA to end their season on a sour note. This season, though, they would be bringing back their best receiver in Hal Bedsole, as well as his starting quarterback the previous year in Bill Nelson. But McKay would also add another quarterback to his rotation in sophomore Pete Beathard. With his 2-quarterback system going, his team would score a huge opening win as they beat a top 10 Duke squad. Then they followed it up with a win at SMU and shut out Iowa on the road to put them at 3-0 and ranked in the top 10. And the 2-quarterback system and the defense would really hit their stride from this point on, as they dismantled the rest of their schedule, with only one team coming within a touchdown of them the whole season. They would end their regular season with a shutout of Notre Dame, and then they would be invited to the Rose Bowl to play number 2 Wisconsin. And I have talked about this season before in my How the Year Was Won 1962. I'll put a link below as well as in the upper right-hand corner right now. But they would play an absolute shootout and one of the best Rose Bowl games as they outlasted Wisconsin 42-37 to end their season 11-0 and win the national title. McKay would end up winning a few more national titles and go from being almost fired to being the talk of LA with this turnaround. And my number 2 turnaround is everyone's favorite turnaround. It's one of my favorite turnarounds, but not my number 1 turnaround. This turnaround would bring June Jones back into our lives and made those midnight Hawaii games something you wanted to stay up for if you were on the East Coast. This is the 1999 Hawaii squad, which went from 0-12 to 9-4. So yeah, Hawaii football was coming off a dismal 0-12 season in 1998, as well as being winless for the last 18 games before that. Hawaii was coached during that losing streak by Fred Von Appen, who tried to turn around Hawaii by using defense, but that resulted in his offense not being able to do a thing. So to turn around their fortunes, Hawaii went out and took a chance on June Jones. Now, I say took a chance because June Jones had made headlines in the early 90s as he was an offensive coordinator and then would be a coach in Atlanta, but would also be famous for getting in a shouting match and almost a fist fight with his quarterback Jeff George all on camera. This would result in him getting canned from Atlanta, sitting out the 1997 season, and then ending up again in San Diego at the Chargers, and then becoming an NFL head coach after they fired their head coach. June Jones' second attempt at being an NFL coach didn't go that good either, as he went 3-7 with his rookie quarterback Ryan Leaf. So after the season, he was looking for a change, and he took the Hawaii job, which paid less than most colleges would, but they were going to give Jones some time with the team. But Jones wouldn't need long to implement his run-and-shoot offense, as they would get smashed in their first game versus USC, but after that, the team would take to Jones' new offense, and the defense did just enough to help Hawaii win their next 4 games for the most wins they had in the last 2 years combined. The team never got blown out again for the rest of the season, and after beating Fresno State in 2 overtimes in mid-November, they would win a share of the Western Athletic Conference title, as there would be a 3-way tie at the top. But still, this team would be 8-4, and they would play in the Oahu Bowl, beating Oregon State to have one of the biggest modern turnarounds in college football history. Hawaii under June Jones for the next 8 years were some of the most fun teams in college football, and this season helped kick off all that fun. But coming in at number 1 is going to be a team that you might not know about, but in seeing the 1-year change Stanford made, it's pretty incredible this team doesn't get enough press, as the 1940 Stanford team went from 1-7-1 to 10-0. And Stanford were the best team on the West Coast through the 1920s and most of the 1930s under Pop Warner. And when Pop Warner left in 1932, Tiny Thornhill, his top assistant, would take over. Thornhill would continue the trend of winning as they won the PCC title and went to the Rose Bowl in Thornhill's first 3 years from 1933 to 1935. But after that, they fell off a cliff, never having a winning record, and ended the 1930s with a 1-7-1 record and being winless in the PCC for the first time in forever. Stanford would let go of Thornhill and go in a completely different direction, as they hired a former Chicago coach in Clark Shaughnessy. The reason why he was available was because after the 1939 season, the University of Chicago would end their football program. And even though Shaughnessy had a great contract, where he was one of the highest paid people at the school, and all he had to do was teach, Shaughnessy would take the long trip across the country to take the Stanford job because he wanted to coach football. And the first thing he did when he got there was install his T formation, which he saw had done wonders for his Chicago teams and also the professional Chicago Bears. Shaughnessy would also add in man and motion concepts and also had more flankers, but it didn't impress the former coach in Pop Warner, who disregarded the new offense, and the players returning were a little skeptical, and rightly so, since Chicago had been pretty terrible the last few seasons under Shaughnessy. But even though the offense was new and a little strange, it would pay off immediately as they shut out the University of San Francisco on the road, and then they did it again versus Oregon the next week. Coaches that saw and tried to practice for Stanford's offense had trouble finding where the ball carrier was, so Stanford kept winning as they beat Washington State on the road, then USC by 14 points, then they beat top 10 ranked Washington by 10, and their rival Cal to end the season 13-6 to be 9-0 and be the top Western team. This would earn them the spot in the Rose Bowl, as they would play the top 10 ranked Nebraska squad who was chosen. And in the game, Nebraska would have a lead early, but Stanford fought them off and cemented their turnaround season with a 21-13 win. The 1940 Stanford team wouldn't win the AP national title, but a few selectors chose them, and the Wow Boys, as they were called, helped turn Stanford into the Western power they were only 5 years before this. And also, this 9-game improvement is the highest of any improvement. Hawaii did it. They were mentioned at number 2, but I have to put Stanford at number 1 since they went from 1-7-1 to completely unbeaten instead of being 9-4 like Hawaii was. Also, Stanford had a share of the national title. No team had gone from 1 win to winning the national title the next year, so it's just pretty incredible. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the list. As always, make sure you comment below. Tell me if there's any other turnaround you think I'm missing. Also, as always, make sure you like and share this video with other college football fans. Subscribe to the channel below, ring the bell, and help out the channel below on my Patreon. You can check out the link in the description below.